It's been really helpful to have Matthew do the presentation that he did this morning, because especially the first chunk of that really feeds into the themes of the workshop that I'm doing today. This workshop came from a conversation, or a number of conversations, that took place between our organisation, Break the Silence, and Paul and Helena at the Safeguarding Agency. Break the Silence is an organisation supporting adult survivors of sexual abuse. And Paul and Helena were keen to find ways in which the agency could be engaging with survivors and hearing their experiences in a more direct way without making them feel that they're being put on the spot. And my, I suppose my caution around this is that in the same way as in America, we're hearing the conversation of people of colour asking white people to, could you stop making us do the work for you? You know what needs to be done here. That similarly, there's a caution perhaps around approaching survivor organisations and asking individuals who've experienced harm to explain to you why this happened, when actually in lots of levels we know why this happened. The premise is that if we can have a language, as Matthew referred to earlier, if we can have a language and we can have words, then we can talk about it, and if we can talk about it, then we can help to make people safer. To echo what everybody else has said earlier, we do want people to be able to not feel too uncomfortable. If I'm going to be honest, your comfort is not my primary concern. These are difficult conversations and they do make us uncomfortable, but I do not want people to feel too upset. So as Matthew said earlier, take a breath, ignore me for a bit or leave the room. I won't be offended. But I will be speaking directly about things in the same way as Matthew did. It's not that it's hugely explicit, but I'm not going to couch the language and I'm not going to use euphemisms. These are just the goals of the workshop: to have a better understanding of abuse and to reflect on environments where people can be at risk, not just within our community, but not excluding our communities. To reflect on the cultural vulnerabilities, partly the west coast of Scotland, but again, more particularly within our Catholic homes and parishes and schools and broader community. And just looking at ways that we can, as individuals, take opportunities to grow safer places, and to, in this workshop, hopefully model just honest, non-judgmental discussions. Any questions are fine. So I just wanted to make sure that we're all starting from the same place in terms of the assumptions that I'm bringing to this conversation. The first is that we can't prevent there being people who want to harm children. There's always going to be people that want to harm children and vulnerable people in our communities. And while there's very good work being done, because we know that often people who harm are people who've been harmed in different ways, we're not going to get rid of it. So what can we do to recognise it and address it? There's always going to be people who are drawn towards roles where they have power over others and will use that in order to harm. That doesn't mean that everybody who, for instance, goes into the police wants to be perhaps controlling or bullying in group situations, but unfortunately, those roles will attract people who would want to do that, and the job gives them the space to operate. So in the same way as in our secular world, the same happens within our faith communities as well. Talking about these issues is really uncomfortable, but we're here because we want to make our communities safer. And if we can talk about these more honestly, if we can develop a language and a vocabulary that we are comfortable with, then actually it will become more comfortable over time. So these are the lies that generally, as communities, especially in communities of faith, these are the lies that we risk telling ourselves, that this stuff doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in my family or my school. These things, not my workplace doesn't have things like that. You know, the football clubs, the gymnastic clubs, the swimming clubs, they don't happen in, like, I come from Prestwick in Ayrshire. this is a nice little town with lots of doctors and nurses and police officers and teachers, and they don't happen here, but we know that they do. And that in the document for the Cross of the Moment, I really noted this, that part of what feeds into our inability to have these conversations and to talk about the hard stuff is that we don't want the illusions that we have of innocence and faith and kindness and love. We don't want these to not be there. And so lots of things get in the way of us being able to see clearly. So just maybe to address those illusions, these are just some of the statistics that relate to Scotland in this last few years. I come from Ayrshire, as I mentioned, and we know that actually commercial sexual exploitation of women who are being brought in from Eastern European countries in particular is quite prevalent in South Ayrshire. We know that there's a whole group of young people and who've been brought in from Vietnam to work in cannabis farms in the area. They don't even know that they're in Scotland. They don't know where Scotland is. So the idea that these things don't happen, that's just not true. They know that the stats around sexual abuse, I mean, you've seen and heard these more than once today, and we know that a huge amount of the harm that's being perpetrated currently is being perpetrated online and often by peers. So we need to be upfront and honest about what's actually happening in our communities. We know that the numbers that are reported are the tip of the iceberg. The majority of people that I work with in my service and in my private practice who disclose sexual abuse have never reported it to the police. They've never reported it to any statutory services. So we know that this is a tiny amount. We need to understand some of the dynamics, some of the patterns, and that children, while they're only 20% of the population, are disproportionately likely to be victims of sexual offence, of many offences, just because they're small and because they can be manipulated and because they have less power. It's not really all that much more complicated than that. It's about power. And that these are some of the things that are maybe helpful to understand when you're trying to make sense of what could be showing up in our communities. That adults who are disabled, for instance, physically hearing impaired, visually impaired, developmentally disabled, much more likely to be harmed. Children who are not living in a home environment with a family, much more likely. So that I hesitate to use the term in care because there's very little care for children who are removed from their homes. We know that, for instance, boys are more likely to be harmed in environments where there's an authority structure, clubs, schools, churches, religious communities. Girls are actually more likely to be harmed at home and with people that they have family relationships with. We also know that there is a massive gender disparity here in terms of vulnerability. 92% of the images online that are classed as indecent and sexualized are of girls and women, and 92% of the perpetrators are male. So within our own communities, is there a way of understanding why there's these particular vulnerabilities? And so it starts from an early age, and we learn not to speak honestly. So this is not my story. Jerry Hughes, I remember reading this story years ago in my 20s and just having that, oh, okay, that makes sense moment. So Jerry Hughes asks us to imagine that God's a family relative and that mum and dad and gran and granddad and everybody speaks really highly of him. All the adults speak really highly. And they talk about him as being this really lovely, lovely man who everybody admires. and that he can do lots of really good things. And he's quite an important person in the family. And so we are taken to visit good old Uncle George, and he lives in this huge mansion with these incredible grounds. And he sounds a little bit gruff when he opens the door, but our parents keep telling us that he's really lovely and everybody's smiling. And so we're there and we're getting a bit scratchy in our smart clothes that we've been made to wear that we don't really like. And everybody's nodding and smiling, and we sit and we have something to eat, and we've been on our best behaviour the whole time. And at the end of the visit, Uncle George turns to the family and he says, now listen, he says, it's so lovely to see you, but I want to see you here at least once a week. And if you fail to come, I'm going to show you what will happen. And then Uncle George leads us down to the mansion's basement. And it's dark and it gets hotter and hotter as we go down. And we hear quite disturbing noises that sound like people shouting and being afraid. And in the basement, there's steel doors, and Uncle George opens one and encourages us to go and have a look. And he says, now look and see. And we see a really frightening vision of flames and fire and people being distressed. And Uncle George says, this is what happens if you don't come and visit me and you don't do the things that I want you to do. And that's how it'll go. And then he takes us back upstairs to see Mum and Dad. And as we go home, tightly holding on to Mum and Dad, still pretty scared, Mum leans over and says, don't you just love Uncle George? And as a child, we go, yeah, uh-huh. And so from a very early age, everybody, because everyone in this room was kids, we learn not to be honest about things that our parents might tell us is important, might tell us is good. And we can feel quite fearful, but we can't say that because, well, he's lovely. Uncle George is lovely. Don't be silly. There's nothing to be scared of. So Jerry Hughes talks about this as religious schizophrenia setting in at an early age. And I just want us to have that picture and understanding as we continue through this. We know that people don't speak. We know that children and vulnerable adults are not just going to come and tell you what's happening. And mainly that's the primary fear is that they won't be believed. And then the next fear is that people will think that they've done something wrong. And then, as Matthew touched on, this whole idea of what a good Catholic, caring, loving family looks like and the implications of that, for the wider community, for their family. But also one of the reasons people don't talk is because there's secrecy is modeled. We don't talk about rude things. People lower their voices or they spell out rude words. And so there's this modeling of secrecy of things that aren't okay to talk about. And within the Cross of the Moment, one of the things that was highlighted is that the people who are in leadership in our communities are also supposed to present themselves as completely asexual. And if there's any inkling to sexuality, it can only be heterosexuality. So again, this whole modeling of secrecy and shame around things to do with sex and sexuality, that really impacts our communities as Catholic communities. I absolutely appreciate it can be very confusing. Catholic teaching on sexuality is often presented or experienced by people as a set of rules, and that those rules say, this is what's normal is good, anything else is really not okay. And yet, all we really have to do is look outside our window, turn on the television. We know that it's just not binary. There's very little in nature that is just one way or the other. And so it does get very complicating. And also, I have 4 kids in their 20s. This whole language, this shifting landscape, is really, really difficult. I think there's currently something like 47 different terms that are used to try and communicate people's expressions or practice, and it is confusing. There's no doubt about it. Some of the conversations around our dinner table, when there's a member of the family who's in their late 80s and 21-year-olds trying to explain transgenderism or the they them name badges, which was going so well until the 89-year-old went, but why can't they just pick one or the other? At which point, the 21-year-old, who's always on his grandmother's side, literally got up, walked to the other side of the table and went, nah, you're on your own now. It's so complicated. So we know that this gets in the way. So then, if I don't really understand it, it's difficult to talk about it. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I also don't want to look like a muppet, which maybe because I have 4 kids in their 20s, I'm fairly used to looking like a muppet and saying the wrong thing, but they'll correct me. So we do know that the church as an institution recognises that there are and have been real embedded cultural issues. And there has been these calls for transparency, which is all very well and good, but what does that mean? How do we practice that? What's being asked of us? And maybe relating to Matthew's talk earlier again, am I brave enough? Am I brave enough to have those conversations? And I have the skills to have consistent communication and understand the breadth of challenges, and also to address the things that we are doing well and doing better. So maybe there's an opportunity for us here this afternoon just to reflect a little bit on not just why don't people tell, because that puts all the emphasis on the person who's been harmed, but why don't we see? Matthew made reference to the cut on his nose in that photo. The number of people that I support who hold very, very responsible, vocational and professional roles, who will go home and cut themselves or burn themselves or harm themselves in other ways. When people are in distress, there are signs, but it can be hard for us to understand what we're seeing. And maybe if we see the cuts and the burns, we can see that's a really tangible physical sign that someone's in distress. But they're often hidden. So what gets in the way of us being able to see when things are just not working well? We know that adults who perpetrate sexual abuse come from all walks of life, but most childhood sexual abuse is committed by adults that the child knows. We know that significant numbers of those older people are siblings, and that's a massively underreported area. And we know that increasingly a lot of it is peer-on-peer abuse and harm, where young people are increasingly being bombarded with images that leave a real confusion about what normal sexual behaviour looks like. And so then when they start to experiment in a completely normal and healthy way for young people and their developing sexuality, then it seems completely normal for a 15-year-old boy to put his hands round his girlfriend's throat, because this is the images they are being seen and shown all the time. We know that while most crime in our communities is carried out by younger people, their brains are wired up for being reckless and impulsive, but we know that the majority of childhood sexual abuse, the perpetrators, in some studies, there's a big study done in Australia, and the perpetrators reported committing their very first offence aged between 25 and 49. So these are not silly young folk. These are, this is an adult problem. So what stops us seeing? Maybe just think for a minute of the image that comes to you when you think about a person who's sexually abused children. Matthew kind of ruined it because he put up such a normal photo earlier. But, you know, when I was doing this last year, there was an image in the local papers of 3 or 4 people from Glasgow who'd been part of a ring where there was drugs and there was child abuse. And it was those awful mugshots where you just knew there was poverty, there was drug use. You know, they looked like paedophiles. But, you know, Matthew kind of showed us a really physical image of that's just not the case. And when you think about a victim, who do you see? You know, again, Matthew did us a huge favour by being able to stand there and give us a really solid image of it is and can be absolutely anybody who is a perpetrator and anybody who's a victim, and there is no this is what it looks like. But if you understand that your perception of who dangerous people are, that absolutely impacts your ability to recognise who might be harmful in your community because, well, you know, people like that don't do things like that. And then just for a minute or two, think about the image that comes into your head when you think about somebody who uses domestic violence to control their family members. Do you know, this is, again, there's all the classic mugshots, but this happens everywhere. And to understand that the pictures that I have in my head of what this might look like totally impacts my ability to engage in a safe way with my community. And it is important to remember that violence against women and children is absolutely not exceptional. And local things just, you know, that have been highlighted in the press in this last year make this really, really clear. It's not an exception. It's happening everywhere. And we can't stop other people wanting to harm necessarily, but we can equip ourselves with an understanding of the reality of what's happening in our communities and have the language to be able to talk about this and create safer communities as a result. Pope Francis has called on us to have a culture change, to create a culture change. And I'm just wondering if you can think about the culture changes that maybe we've all experienced just in the last 20 years. Desert island discs. It used to always be classical music. It's actually really rare to hear classical music on desert island discs anymore, which I prefer. Golf clubs. My son worked in a golf club that still doesn't have women members. But as a result, they're not allowed to have the open. Smoking in pubs. We've all grown up in an environment where it was normal to come home from the pub and drop your clothes into the wash basket. And for me, I hated it because I had to go and wash my hair. And it took ages to dry. And so, I mean, I suppose it was good because it made me not want to go very often. But if you'd said 30 years ago that Scotland would have had no smoking in pubs, folk would have laughed you out the place. So we have all lived through culture change. We can do it. And most of us would agree that a lot of the shifts create a place that allows people to come to be more inclusive, to feel safer. And that our understanding of what is normal changes as a result of that. It was normal to come home from a pub stinking of smoke. It's absolutely not anymore. It was normal to see windscreens on cars with big dents in the front because when there were accidents, people went through the windscreen. Now everybody wears seatbelts. We don't see that anymore. But when they first came in, there was lots of moaning about an infringement of rights and how people didn't want to do it. Now it's almost, I don't think I've even seen a car with something in the windscreen like that. And I don't know anyone who doesn't just automatically put their seatbelt on. So we can do culture change. We can make things different. I just want to make sure that we're all singing from the same song sheet. Behaviour that intentionally harms, controls, or manipulates another person. It often happens in the context of power imbalance. And it often, the goal is for dominance over another person. Sometimes it's about an attempt to maintain control, but it often results in harm. Where have we all experienced power dynamic? Everybody in the room's experienced parent and child, husband and wife power dynamics. Change in the law that meant that I was 19 before it was legally recognised that a man could rape his wife in this country. I was 19. Up until then, he could rape his wife because he had the right to her. Older siblings and younger siblings, we've all done things, you know. Well, my sister says I made her do terrible things. And you know, we've all done things because our big brother told us to, or a big cousin got us to, you know, to go and get those biscuits out the kitchen. You know, these are just part of our life. Adults in any setting and children, there's a power dynamic. Teachers and children, laity and clergy, religious, police and the public. So power dynamics are part of our existence. It's not a bad thing to have them. But wherever there are power dynamics, there's a breeding ground for abuse. It doesn't have to happen, but it has the potential. So again, we just need to be aware that that's the case. And it is happening everywhere, mainly in the home and family and community spaces. The places where we used to think were safer. I was definitely of the age where we got the "don't go with strangers" film at school. I mean, the stats for abduction and harm by strangers of children hasn't really changed in this country since the 60s. Strangers are not the risk to children and vulnerable adults. We know that most of the harm is perpetrated by family members and trusted adults, and it is increasingly online and increasingly from peers. One of the things that's perhaps important for us in the context of our parish communities to recognise is that when they did the Cross of the Moment document and piece of research from Durham University, they asked 3 cohorts of people if they perceived that sexual abuse was still an issue within the church. And so if you think it's going to happen, you're going to pay more attention. Yeah, if you think you're going to trip, you're going to watch for what that is or where the trip risks are. And so really disturbingly, 17% of people who'd never been part of a faith community said, no, of course it's not a thing of the past. 25% of people who went to church sometimes said, no, you know, we don't think it's a thing of the past. And the group that thought that the Catholic Church did no longer have a problem with sexual abuse, 32% of regular churchgoers thought that sexual abuse was no longer an issue within the Catholic Church, which again just goes to highlight the most dangerous places are the familiar places. This can be a helpful tool. People who work around harmful sexual behaviour will recognise this continuum of sexual behaviour. But when we don't talk about it, when sex is only supposed to happen with the lights out once you're married in order to have children, and we can't talk about it otherwise, then it's really tricky to engage with the reality that our sexuality is as normal a part of our makeup as anything else. And so what is normal? What then becomes harmful and what becomes abusive or violent? We need to be able to understand normal to be able to identify abnormal. But are we actually ready to discuss it? Are we ready to recognise that all children go through phases of sexual development, and that just like every other part of growing up, some of them will do that quicker than others? There are 14-year-old boys that look like they're 12, and there are 14-year-old boys that look like they're 18, and they're the ones. My son's rugby club, there was always one lad and he had a bit of stubble, and you always knew that he'd get sent at the awards night to see if he could get the pints to bring back to the table of all the other wee boys who hadn't even started to shave yet. People mature at different levels, physically and sexually. So if we know what's normal and we know that sex and sexuality is just a part of who we are, then why is nobody talking about it, and why is nobody talking about the fact that this happens everywhere? So we don't have the language. We've been told it's dirty and it's wrong. Matthew covered a lot of this earlier. And it makes it hard. These are the barriers, the resistances to us being able to develop a language in our homes, in our communities that help to keep us safe. And there are cultural barriers to transparency that are perhaps, more directly related to our own immediate culture here in the west coast of Scotland or within Western Europe, and in different parts of the world. Things that are taboo are different, but they are often come back to stuff around naked bodies, sex and sexuality. There's also a really tricky one within our own Catholic community that had such a huge impact in terms of the movement of priests from one place to another. I would suspect that if you were to ask any parent who had a child who disclosed something but didn't want to take it to the police, or any member of the institution who moved a priest from one place to the other, maybe I'm being naive, but I suspect their motivation was not that they didn't care what this person would do in the next parish, but they were trying to protect something that they had been brought up believing fundamentally, that that you don't do anything that harms the image of the church. And we've all done that in our families. As individuals, I want you just to think for a minute about when you were growing up, from your mum and dad, from your granny, from your teachers at school, from maybe youth retreats that you went on, or just adults that you really liked. What were the messages about sex? Was it something that was talked about openly? Was it something to be ashamed of, and definitely not something that, good families talk about over the dinner table? So then, if that's what you've grown up with, just think about how it influences you now. This is such a benign analogy, but my grandmother was born and raised in India. I thought it was completely normal to eat chapati and jam for your breakfast. That was just normal. I didn't actually eat it in my own house because my dad didn't, but I didn't think there was anything unusual about it. That just became what was kind of normal. So these things that we grow up with shape what's normal. And it takes somebody, I think I was 12 when I was leaving the house, and I shouted up to my grandmother who was there, "Bye, bye, Nana." And she shouted bye back to me. And a friend who I'd maybe just met at secondary school, who'd never met her, mimicked her accent, not in a cruel way, just joking. I was 12, and it was the first time I'd realised, oh, my Nana's not white and she doesn't sound Scottish, because it was just so normal. But how I have made sense of things, how this was given to me, shapes how I give it to somebody else. So when I'm talking to children, Matthew made reference to this about how if you don't have the word for something, how do you talk about it? And we know that shame plays a massive part. Matthew talked about that again. Matthew was able to show that overlap between guilt and shame, that they're not the same. So guilt is if I think I've done something wrong, but shame is this feeling that there's something wrong with me. Again, Matthew said one of the things that got in the way of him disclosing was because it was all mixed up with kind of private parts and sex, that there was something bad that he had done that had invited this behavior. We know that shame thrives where there's secrecy, silence, and judgment. and that in the past, public shaming was an attempt to correct behaviour, but now increasingly we understand that it is much more likely to drive people into much more secret ways of behaving, and that then becomes more harmful. We know that shame shows up in lots of places in our communities, and it is a really harmful thing. It's a social emotion, it's a social tool. People aren't embarrassed or ashamed in private if they think nobody's going to judge them. So it's the influence of how they'll be perceived by other people that is one of the huge factors in shame, and it results in people, again, Matthew talked about separating himself off from these experiences. It creates this inner disconnection, but it also creates disconnection from people close to them. We know that when people are disconnected from others, they are more likely to be identified by somebody who would be predatory and harmful. But we also know that when people feel disconnected, they become more vulnerable to harming themselves and others. And this is just an example of what can happen when shame turns up in a relatively stable, normal home where there's a young girl a couple of years ago who took her own life. And it transpired that she had engaged in an online chat room, and she had been befriended by a young girl who was a similar age and had disclosed over time that she was kind of confused about her sexuality and she thought she might be gay. And over some time, this other girl and her exchanged messages and lots of support for one another. And then she was persuaded to send a picture of herself topless. And at that point, the 12-year-old girl in the chat room identified themselves as a grown man. And they then used it to blackmail her into sending more and more explicit things. And then at the point where because he would threaten to send the images to her parents, and then at the point where he tried to get her to bring her little sister into the images, this child's only recourse, because I can't tell them that I've been doing this, I can't tell them that I might be gay, she took her own life. And she was 12. That's what shame does. Shame means that I can't go and say, a bit like the Gabor Mate thing earlier that Matthew showed. And that in this environment where there's secrecy, silence, and judgment, it really thrives. And so this young girl, the fundamental issue was she was confused about her sexuality. She couldn't possibly talk about that because of the inherent homophobia in her community. And so it led to her being blackmailed and taking her own life. I just want to reflect on what does normal look like. The continuum from earlier, this girl was 12 years old. She was engaging in that normal questioning and curiosity around herself, her sexuality, what that looked like. And it ended up with her taking her own life because somebody manipulated that fear of how she would be judged because she thought she might be gay. So how can we help to protect people? Just have a think for a minute. Somebody that you really care about, you can see that they're not themselves, and you approach them and ask them how they're doing. And you can tell that they're unhappy. They say that, but they don't know if they can talk about it. So I just want you for just 5 seconds to consider how you might behave in order to reassure this person that it is safe for them to talk to you, that there's nothing that you can say that it's going to be a problem for me. I can cope with whatever you have to tell me. So again, if you think about the do's in Matthew's thing around disclosure earlier, and remembering that a big part of it is that if anybody, child or a vulnerable adult, is telling you, they're not going to most likely just dump it at the door of somebody that they've spoken to for the first time. So they've been checking out how much they can tell you before you flinch. They've been checking out potentially over time in the classroom or in the church hall or at a family gathering over time Are you the kind of person that if I tell you that somebody's been doing these things to me, you're not going to flinch and look away? And so we know that words and behaviours are really important. And so what can we do? Richard Rohr always seems to have some lovely perspectives, and this was one that he offered. We are all sexual. Sexuality is simply the longing for totality, completion, for wholeness. There are levels of intimate desire going on within all living things and between all living people to reveal the desire for God and the need for others. Wherever you see something that you are not and you want to be that, take that into yourself and give yourselves to it so that you can be whole. That's the search for God. It's neither bad nor shameful. Our sexual desire, our sexual drive is no moral test from God. It is God teaching us that we are not whole within ourselves and that we must be in relationship. And God pulls us out of ourselves by every means possible. Without sexuality, we would live private, antiseptic lives and the world would be cold. So in our culture, in the families we've grown up in and the messages that we've absorbed, I wonder what it might be like to consider aspects of ourselves, of our sexuality as inherently good. And how might that influence the way we think about sex, sexuality, and relationships? And so maybe to bring us full circle back to why we have this conversation, why it's important for us to understand that the way we think about ourselves, our relationships, our sexuality, how we speak about it, has an impact. I'm going to leave you with this. Some of our community at Break the Silence were involved with a campaign with Child Protection Scotland, instead looking at the barriers around safety, and they can say it better than I can.
Well, I was sexually and physically and emotionally abused since I can remember, almost daily, until I was 12, and I tried to pretend that nothing had happened and that I was fine. He just warned me that I better not tell them because, you're going to get in trouble. Because if I was the one going to get in trouble.
When I was 8-year-old, a family member was coming out of my room and putting hands under my cover, touching me. It was horrific. I was timid and shy when I was young, and then I started getting really angry and my life went totally downhill, total turmoil, complete and utter chaos.
When I was younger, from about the age of 4, I was sexually abused by 4 different people. 3 of them were family members. The door was next to the wall, and as the door opened, the shadow would slide up the wall and grow larger, and you just knew what was coming and what was going to happen.
I don't remember a time where I wasn't abused, where I wasn't touched, where I wasn't made to do things. I was probably younger than 8 when they started raping me. I did hit someone and I was told not to be silly. I don't think adults are necessarily very good at believing small children.
He would come in and check my bed every morning, and if it was wet, he would bring it out with a buckle, but he never used it. He used to sell and steal rape me every single morning. We lived 4 in a block, and the neighbours must have heard something, but nobody stepped in.
If you hear or see something which makes you think a child might be being sexually abused, don't think, what if I'm wrong? Think, what if I'm right? Take action before things get worse.
So I hope that taking the time this afternoon has created a space for you to understand the reality of the communities we're living in, the challenges that are there, but also maybe just to be able to reflect on the things that I can do, the things that you can do just in yourself to make those tweaks in terms of our perceptions our attitudes and our responses to things that feel difficult. And within Christian and Catholic communities, there are real challenges around talking honestly and openly about the reality of sex and sexuality, how that shows up in our families, how it shows up in our communities. But if we can't find a way to create a safe, open space to be able to talk about these difficult things, then they stay secret. And when they stay secret, people can manipulate that silence. The only thing we can do, and it's so impactful, is just to not make it shameful, not to make it a secret, to be able to speak openly in our families. And then actually, it's really hard for perpetrators to be able to manipulate the vulnerability, because the vulnerability is much less. So, thank you very much. Does anybody?